Good morning, book lovers. Hopefully everything's working. My name is Linda Huntoon, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 10th Annual Savannah Book Festival, presented by Georgia Power and the Sheehan Family Foundation. We are blessed to host such celebrated authors in the Trinity United Methodist Church today, which has been made possible by the generosity of Kurt and Libba Anderson. We'd like to extend special thanks to our literati members and individual donors who have made and continue to make Saturday's festival free. Before I get started, there's the traditional caveats. Immediately following this presentation, John Tamny will be signing festival purchase copies of his book, Intel Fair Square. His is slightly different today because he has a short interview with C-SPAN immediately following, so that gives you time to get to the tent before him. We have a new policy this year. If you're planning for the next author presentation to stay here, please move forward so that the venue empties and the ushers can determine how many seats they have for people coming in. Please, please, please take this moment to turn off your cell phones. And we also ask that you not use flash photography. And for the question and answer portion this year, we are passing a microphone. So there's no lining up in the center aisle or any of some of the things we've done in the years past. There are lots of people around with microphones. And Mr. Tamny is happy to take questions. John Tamny is with us today courtesy of Hall and Letty McAdams and Barbara Paul. He is a senior fellow at Reason Foundation, a senior economic advisor to Toreador Research and Trading, and an editor of RealClearMarkets.com, RCM. Mr. Tamny frequently writes about the securities market, along with tax, trade, and monetary policy issues that impact those markets for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, Financial Times, National Review, and London's Daily Telegraph. Please give a warm Savannah welcome to John Tamny.
Linda, thank you very much for the gracious introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's passionate book people like you that make it possible for me to get to do what I love, and so I can't stress my gratitude enough. Also want to thank the Savannah Book Festival for including me as I look out at the other authors and the other books being featured this weekend. I can't believe I'm in such good company. These are authors whom I've read for years. I'm kind of clicking my heels up here that I get to be part of this. And so I want to thank the excellent festival, Kim Bacchius-Swin, for all the work she did to make it possible for me to be here. I'd like to add to that Letty McAdams. It's not in a literal sense, but I believe she moved mountains to get me in the position to be here today. And so I'm forever in Letty's debt, and also to her husband, Hall, who's in the audience today. There quite simply would not be a book called Who Needs the Fed if not for Hall. What Hall knows about banking and credit could fill many, many thick books. And over the last 13 years, he's taught me enormous amounts. He's been so patient in discussions in person, by email, over the phone about these issues. And if I had not discussed all this with Hall and learned so much from him, there never would have been a reason to write Who Needs the Fed in the first place. And so a big thanks to Hall. Before I get into the book, I'll talk a little bit about my background. I was actually born in Charleston, South Carolina, so not too far from here. My dad was in the nuclear Navy. He served under the great Admiral Hyman Rickover. Once he got out of the Navy, we lived in Dallas and Atlanta. Then we moved to Boston for 2 years so that he could go to business school. And then we moved out to Los Angeles, and I grew up in Pasadena, California. It was probably during grade school that I discovered not knowing it at the time what I would eventually be doing in terms of writing about economics and economic policy. There were these little children's books in grade school about presidents called Meet Thomas Jefferson, Meet Ben Franklin, Meet George Washington, and I would read them over and over again. And I would kind of be off to the side in class reading these books, and I went to my parents one night and I said, I'm worried that I'm in trouble at school. I'm not participating in the other things. And so my parents went to the teacher, and the teacher said, no, we're thrilled that he's interested in these books. Please have him continue. And so it was probably signaled something ahead. For college, I went to the University of Texas and majored in political science, but not for any good reason. It seemed like the most interesting major at the time. I can't say I learned a whole lot one way or the other. I think most kids in school, that's generally what they do. Their focuses are elsewhere. After college, I worked in sales for 4 years and then went to Vanderbilt's Owen Graduate School of Management to get my MBA. Now, while at Vanderbilt, I decided to go the normal route. It was a booming bull market in the late 90s, so I thought, okay, I'll get into equities just like everyone else, and I took a job at Goldman Sachs. And that's where what began that's where my future career took shape. While other people were on the trading floor passionate about equities, I would look around and watch CNBC on the different screens, and my focus was on the economists talking about the economy. That's what really had my interest. And what intrigued me the most is that there was this constant stream of commentary at the time in the late 90s saying that if the economy grew too much, as in if people prospered too much, if too many people were working and creating companies, that there was a negative downside, that it would cause inflation. And I thought, wait a second, I grew up in the 1970s. I know what inflation is. It's a devaluation of the dollar. It's when the Treasury shrinks the value of the dollar. And I thought inflation is something that occurs exclusive of economic growth. When economies are growing, investment surges, and so the prices of everything drop. And so I'd looked throughout history. I remember the first mobile phone in the early 80s. Motorola put it out, brick-sized, a half-hour of battery life. If you want to make a call from Savannah to Atlanta, it was going to cost you a fortune in roaming charges. And I thought, well, nowadays you can get mobile phones for a fraction of the price. And then I knew from history that the first mainframe computer was created by IBM in the 1960s. It cost over $1 million. Even by the late 90s, you could get a pretty good computer for a few thousand. Nowadays, we see we can get them for a few $100s, but I thought that's another example of the persistent drop in the price of everything, thanks to investment. Everything I looked rejected the common view of economics from economists that somehow growth was a problem, that the Fed and central banks had to plan it to make sure that we didn't prosper enough. And so I wasn't allowed to do this. Goldman Sachs was full of immensely talented people, and they were very specific that you did your job, that you didn't go outside what you were doing. But I secretly started writing for clients commentary saying that what you're hearing on CNBC, what you're reading in the newspapers, is belied by basic economic history and common sense. And so I started thinking, this is what I really want to do. And then by 2001, the stock market started to dive. What people pejoratively referred to as the internet bubble effectively popped. Now, what I would say about that is I don't think there's such thing as a bubble. That run-up in internet stocks was a beautiful thing. It was a sign of economic progress, as was the decline of those internet companies. It's when when there's lots of failure in an economy that you know an economy is progressing. You need that constant experimentation to get you to a better place. And so people looked at that period as a negative, but I looked at it as a time in which the world and the U.S. economy were utterly transformed by advances that we could not live without today. Now, the downside to this big drop in equity prices, particularly in the internet economy, was that suddenly Goldman Sachs wasn't as interested in my services as they had been a few years ago. And I'll say that was rather devastating at the time. You start to question yourself, you start to question what kind of person you are. Can I ever succeed again? Am I doomed for failure? But in fact, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I'd already caught the bug. I thought, I want to be commenting on the economy. About this, I'll stress up front, I'm not an economist, and I wear that lack of a PhD with pride. I'm not a journalist either, but I thought, I have got to write about this. It would pain me to not be in the field of commentary in these subjects. And so the negative about Goldman Sachs ultimately forced me to figure out what I really wanted to do. And ultimately, I moved to Washington, D.C., not as an economist or as a writer about economics, but as a fundraiser for the Cato Institute. My plan was to pay the bills, working during the day, meeting donors. That was how I was going to pay the bills so that I could write at night and on weekends. And that's how I met Hall McAdams. And I met people like Hall who utterly transformed how I viewed the world and made me even more determined to become an economic commentator. And gradually I did. Don't claim a Horatio Alger story or anything like that, but my initial online columns, that was the other beauty of the internet boom, is it made it possible for someone like me to have a voice, whereas before I couldn't have had one. And so I began as a writer from Washington, D.C. No one wanted to have an association with someone like me, but gradually I developed a reputation, and my reputation was one of basically working against or contradicting the conventional wisdom about economics. I felt that the economics profession had lost its way, that it had become about charts and formulas and percentages rather than a beautiful story of human action. And I thought, people don't dislike economics, they just dislike how it's been explained to them. And my argument was that if people could see the beautiful world around them, if they could understand sports, movies, television, famous people and businesses, they would understand all that they would ever need to know about economics. And so that has been my style of writing for all this time. And so my first book, Popular Economics, which all of you should buy several copies of later today, was a book that explained economic growth through movies and sports and television. It got rid of all the graphs that had wrecked what is really informative and essential. And Who Needs the Fed, which is the book I'm talking about today, is another example. I explain central banking and credit and money through things that people can understand. And that's been my goal throughout all this, is that economics is fun, but people have taken the fun out of it. And it led to the book, Who Needs the Fed? Now, about Who Needs the Fed, what I want to stress up front is, please don't be fooled by the title or cover. This is a very optimistic book. This is a book that argues that the Fed was never nearly as powerful or influential as is commonly assumed, and even better, that market forces are rapidly rendering the Fed irrelevant right before our eyes. What can't be stressed enough about the Fed is that it doesn't have any resources. It can't increase credit. It cannot shrink credit. The Fed can only misallocate the credit that we've already created in the real economy. The Fed is large not because of the talented people there. It's not active in the markets because the people there have a specific skill that the rest of that central bankers around the world don't have. Let's remember, there are central banks in Nigeria, Cayman Islands, Barbados, Bahamas. Central banks are everywhere. We have a large one simply because the American people are the most economically productive people on earth. The Fed's swagger is not its own. And that's the broad point of my book, that when we talk about the Fed, we're misunderstanding. It doesn't have the credit. It can't increase it. The Fed can only misallocate the resources we've already created. And the argument I make in the book is that we vastly overstate just how much the Fed misallocates. It's just not that important. But I'm a big believer in market forces and market signals. I think that they're full of information. And in the same way, I think the electorate's full of information. There is lots of skepticism right now in the world about our central bank. And I think there's some skepticism based on, one, on a misperception, and two, based on a very real understanding that the world the Fed lives in is not defined by reality. Now, the misperception is rooted in the idea, popularized by economists, politicians, and pundits, that money and credit are one and the same. But in fact, money and credit couldn't be more different. If they were the same, Haiti and Honduras would have every bit as much credit flowing through their economies as we do in the United States. I would add that that would mean that counterfeiting would not only be legal, but it'd be broadly encouraged. In fact, credit is real economic resources. To paraphrase Ludwig von Mises, when you borrow dollars, you're not borrowing dollars. You're borrowing access to computers, trucks, tractors, desks, chairs, buildings, most of all labor. We are the credit in the economy. We are the producers of the resources that when people seek to borrow dollars, they're trying to attain. The Fed has no private stash of resources over here that it can release into the economy. We are the creators of it. Now, the frustration with the Fed is somewhat separate. People read in the media, they watch the pundits on TV, they read in newspapers, will the Fed ease? Will the Fed tighten credit? Will the Fed keep money easy at 0%? And I think the electorate properly looks at that and says, something's wrong with this picture. That doesn't reflect the reality that we know. Apple Computer is the most valuable company in the world, yet even it pays 3% to borrow. Anyone who's ever started a small business or owned a small business knows that to attain credit, it costs quite a bit more than 0%. It's much higher than 3%, higher and higher all the time. And that's the broad point of the first part of my book, is that while the Fed's over here decreeing easy access to credit and easy money in its infinite unwisdom, in the real economy, we act as though the Fed doesn't exist. And that's a very positive statement about where we are. Thinking about Hollywood, Brian Grazer is easily the most talented movie producer in the history of the industry. We're talking about Splash, Parenthood, A Beautiful Mind, Apollo 13. We're talking about television shows like Empire, 24, and Arrested Development. But as Grazer freely acknowledges, his attempts to attain credit to fund his movie and TV ideas fail 90% of the time. For this person with a near perfect track record, Hollywood, as he puts it, is the land of no. What about Silicon Valley? It's commonly assumed that if you've got a startup idea out in the valley, that money sources will be to path to your door trying to invest with you. But as evidenced by all the billionaire venture capitalists out in Silicon Valley, we know that credit's incredibly expensive out there. If you want to fund your startup idea, you'll first give up a big portion of your business to a venture capitalist, and then you'll give up even more of it in the form of stock options to lure potential employees. What about investment banking? One of the things that offends me most in modern times is how media members have made Wall Street a pejorative. And it created the perception that investment bankers are somehow bad people. I can't think of a more important profession than investment banking, and one of the reasons they're paid so well has to do with the basic truth that in the real economy, the price of credit's very expensive. It's one thing to come up with an idea for a business or come up with an idea to expand your business, but it's quite another thing to attain the resources, the credit necessary to build on your vision. And so investment bankers are paid very well, properly so, because they can do for businesses what businesses can't do for themselves. Many of you remember the name Michael Milken. The media, in a similar way, demonized him. He spent time in prison for charges that had never been prosecuted on anyone before. I would argue that Michael Milken's one of the greatest capitalists who ever lived. And his insight back in the 1960s and 70s was that unless you were the bluest of blue chip businesses, you were largely shut out of the credit markets. The traditional banks did not regard you as a reasonable credit risk. And so Milken's genius, the source of his fortune, was the high yield bond. It was his way of finding more expensive credit for really promising businesses. Time Warner, CNN, Golden Nugget Hotels, the list is long of the great businesses that he attained credit for. And the broad point is, Milken's fortune was a function of the fact that while the Feds often Never Never Land decreeing easy credit, He found it for very difficult credit sources. Unless you're a blue chip, it's very hard to attain credit in the real economy. All of which brings us to our 45th president, Donald Trump. I like to sell books, and so I like to have stories about people who are famous. I feel like that will drive more people to buy it, as all of you should. And so thinking about Donald Trump, and let me stress that this is not a political statement, many of you remember that he reached his height as a real estate mogul back in the 1980s. That's when he was viewed as the developer who could do no wrong, the man who had the vision for what the future of tall buildings would be. Now, what's interesting about Trump is that as early as 1990, he was already viewed as a very major credit risk by U.S. banks. In 1990, I tell the story in the book, he flew out to Los Angeles to visit with Security Pacific Bank, which at the time was the 5th largest U.S. bank. He wanted to borrow $50 million in order to fund the revitalization of the Ambassador Hotel. Now, as you can imagine from modern times, Trump arrived at this meeting full of confidence and swagger about his amazing balance sheet of assets, full of some of the best properties on earth, and that were easily highly liquid. He was the best lending option you had out there. Why wouldn't you? You probably should give me $100 million. Well, the bankers had an entirely different view of his assets. They didn't trust them. They looked at them as highly illiquid, that if he ran into difficulty paying off his debt, these wouldn't necessarily be easily sold. And so they refused his request for a $50 million loan, and they ultimately loaned him $10 million. They wanted to be associated with his celebrity. And they ultimately lived to regret that decision. 2 years later, they wrote down the loan in total. He didn't pay a dime back. And it's been well known ever since the early 90s that U.S. banks generally have not touched Donald Trump. He was viewed as toxic. He had a very bad credit reputation with U.S. banks. Let me stress that's not a political statement, but it is a statement about credit. While the Fed is once again over here decreeing zero rates of interest, in the real economy, interest rates float up and down as though the Fed doesn't exist. And again, that's a hugely positive statement about the U.S. and global economy that I would add. If the Fed were a fraction of as powerful as is commonly assumed, we wouldn't be the richest nation on earth. It's the fact that the Fed's just not that consequential that is a signal that we're an incredibly rich nation. It just doesn't influence the flow of credit nearly as much as people think. Only among academics and economists, untouched by reality and untouched by the real world, is there such thing as easy credit. In the real economy, its price is set by market forces, and that's a very positive thing. And so the question in the book becomes, do we need a Federal Reserve? Do we need a central bank? As you can probably guess, my take is that we don't need one. My argument is that if the Fed were shut down tomorrow, few would notice. The Fed began 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago in 1913, as a lender of last resort to solvent banks. If you were a very well-run bank with excellent assets on your books and you ran into a near-term cash crunch, the Fed existed as a source of a loan just to tide you over until some of the cash came back in. But as we've seen over the last 100 plus years, it's unheard of for a solvent bank to go to the Fed for a loan. To do so is an admission of bankruptcy. And that's the case because there are myriad non-Fed sources of credit always willing to lend to a well-run bank. And so what this has meant for the banking system overall is that the Fed has existed to weaken it, because the Fed has become a lender of last resort to insolvent banks that did not rate a loan in the real economy. Imagine that in Silicon Valley if there was always a central authority that could bail out your weakest companies. That means that Webvan, Friendster, the Globe.com, and eToys would still exist. Silicon Valley would be a very rundown, kind of impoverished place. Its wealth is a function of the fact that its bad businesses regularly die. The Fed has weakened the banking system by virtue of it propping up over the years the weakest at the expense of the most successful banks. The Fed is also a bank regulator. Now, my argument, and this will offend a few, is that what a laughable presumption. If you're working at the Fed, that's usually a signal you couldn't get a job at a bank in the first place. And so you're asking those of lesser talent to police those who have much more talent. But I would add that with regulators and regulations, we're asking the impossible of them. We're asking something of them that even the smartest bankers in the world could not do. We're asking them to see into the future, to detect trouble spots within banks well before problems arise. Well, if they could do that, they'd be earning billions in the private sector. They would quite literally be the richest investors in the world. Because even the smartest investors in the world fully admit that majority of the time they are late to a problem. So with the regulation, we're asking the impossible, meaning it's very expensive, but it achieves less than nothing, just weakens the banking system even more. Then, of course, the Fed famously targets the rate at which banks lend to one another overnight, the Fed funds rate. But an interest rate's a price like any other. You don't need the Federal Reserve for that. Banks could easily set that price and do on their own. The Fed targets, it doesn't set anything. And so again, my argument is we should end what serves no useful purpose. If we ended the Fed, few would notice, but I fully accept that my view is a bit on the outside. If you talk to most economists, they would say, oh my, the economy quite simply couldn't function without a central bank. What are you talking about? We would be in a nonstop depression mode if not for the Federal Reserve. Don't you know? And I point out that John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world before the Fed, but it's constantly rejected the very idea that I would say we don't need a central bank. And so the arguments are many. The Keynesian school of economics makes the broad point about the Fed that we need it to increase credit in the economy during recessionary periods to basically prop up an economy that's weakening or that's in free fall. Now, this theory fails in two very important ways. For one, it can't be forgotten that recessions are incredibly healthy. As agonizing as they are, as dispiriting, as much as they kill our morale in the near term, recessions are the amazingly bullish signal of the massive economic boom on the way, simply because recessions signal an economy cleansing itself of all the misuses of labor, of all the bad habits, all the bad investments, and all the lousy companies that were holding the economy down in the first place. And so when recessions take hold, that's the exact time when you want government to do less than nothing, simply because recessions, if left alone, signal the boom on the way. And so you don't want a central bank acting and trying to allocate credit. That means that the private sector has less credit to allocate, and it means bad companies are being propped up at the expense of what would be much greater future growth. The other problem with the Keynesian theory gets back to something more basic. The Fed has no credit to increase. Again, it doesn't have some private stash of resources around the country that it can release into the economy. The Fed can only increase credit insofar as market-disciplined actors in the real economy have less to increase. And so as a rule, when the Fed or any central bank acts aggressively to fight a recession, in fact, what it's doing is fighting the recovery, simply because it's instantaneously misallocating resources that would otherwise be pushed to a higher use, usually misallocating to what's already failed to the economy's broad detriment. Now, the monetarist school of economics has a very different view, and in fairness to it, somewhat of a more limited view of what the Federal Reserve should do. Monetarists argue that the Fed should control the money supply, that it should oversee a set increase in the supply of dollars into circulation on an annual basis. The late Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate and free marketeer extraordinaire, is most associated with this view. My comment in the book is that this is an example of Milton Friedman explicitly promoting central planning. And the reason for that is basic. Money supply is never a problem where there's productivity. To paraphrase Ludwig von Mises once again, no nation or individual need ever worry about having too little money. Where there's enormous amounts of productivity, money and credit are everywhere. Where there's very little productivity, money and credit are always and everywhere scarce. To get into specifics, Beverly Hills never has a money supply problem. Greenwich, Connecticut never has a money supply problem. The Fed couldn't keep money supply and credit off of the island of Manhattan on its very best day. There are too many productive people there such that they're a magnet for credit and the money that's used to attain that credit. But let's imagine a city that's suffering economic problems right now, a poorer city, a city like Baltimore in Maryland. Let's imagine if the Fed, because the Fed believes it can stimulate economic growth with its monetary policies, let's imagine that the Fed decides to stimulate Baltimore, and it proceeds to buy up treasuries from Baltimore banks to increase loanable funds in the banks there. Such a scenario would fail between breakfast and lunch. And it would simply because banks can't long stay in business lending to individuals and businesses who lack the means to pay the monies borrowed back. And so any increase in the supply of dollar credit in Baltimore would instantaneously leave Baltimore from those banks outside the city and probably outside of the state of Maryland itself. Now, in modern times, economists always look for new ways to aggrandize themselves and add to their importance. They're always looking to solutions when an economy is just individuals that, if left alone, would do just fine. And so the latest in the past years, economists have talked about helicopter drops of money. Now, by that, they're not talking literally about the Fed dropping helicopter money into cities, but their idea is let's just produce money en masse and people will consume, and that will lead to economic growth. But the Fed does have an Air Force, so let's imagine a drop of billions of dollars into the city of Baltimore. And let's imagine something even more realistic, that the citizens of the city would pick these billions of dollars up and spend them right there. But let's assume that. Such a scenario would fail just as much as the increase in the supply of money in banks. And it would, simply because even if they spent every dollar in Baltimore, no business is going to expand based on a helicopter drop. So they'd bank the windfall, and the money would once again be rapidly lent out well outside of Baltimore. Now, actual economists say, well, John, you're not an economist, you don't understand. Central banks focus on countries. Okay, so let's focus on a country. Several years ago, when Greece ran into economic trouble, monetarists argued that the answer is for the European Central Bank to increase the supply of euros in Greek banks. Okay, but the same scenario applies. Economic activity in Greece did not rate increased money and credit. So any increase in the supply of euros in Greek banks would boomerang back to Germany and other more economically productive locales almost instantaneously. Now let's reverse this scenario now and think about Silicon Valley, a place that's known for enormous wealth and productivity. In this instance, the Fed believes right up to the top that economic growth causes inflation. You've heard me say that already, but it's something that I'm passionate about. The very people who are oddly charged with planning our economy, which they can't do, but the people charged with it actually believe that prosperity has a downside. And so the Fed has forever believed that it must neuter economic growth, essentially put people out of work, to slow down the economic growth that would otherwise cause inflation. So let's imagine the Fed, seeing Silicon Valley, says, okay, we're going to start selling bonds to Silicon Valley banks to decrease the supply of money there. Well, such a scenario would fail between lunch and dinner, almost instantaneously, and it would because we reside in a global economy. There are savers and investors around the world desperate for exposure to the most economically productive people on earth. So if the Fed shrinks the supply of dollars in those banks, it would be made up instantaneously by savers around the world. The broad point here is that the Fed quite simply cannot increase money and credit in locales where there's not a lot of productivity and that are struggling economically as a result. Much the same, in productive locales, there's no need for the Fed. Money and credit sources around the world are fighting to have exposure to it. The Fed quite simply cannot do what its critics and its supporters say it can do. All of which brings us to the Austrian school. Now, my book is an explicit tribute to Ludwig von Mises's classic book, The Theory of Money and Credit. But despite that, in the book, I'm very critical of what I term neo or modern Austrians. Many modern Austrians have made the argument that the major U.S. economic booms of the 20th century, 1920s, 1980s, 1990s, were a creation of an easy central bank creating excess credit and basically putting the economy on a sugar high. They also argue that China's modern rise was a function of an easy central bank in China, once again printing with abandon and creating easy credit. My point in the book is that this is an example of the Austrians embracing the very Keynesianism that they despise, that they run away from. Because Austrians correctly make the point when they talk to Keynesians. Keynesians will say another way to stimulate the economy is for governments to spend with abandon. And Austrians make the correct point that, no, governments can only spend insofar as they extract real resources from the private sector first. The negatives for the economy are instantaneous when governments presume to spend because politicians, this is true of Republicans or Democrats, can't allocate precious resources in disciplined fashion. And so the spending is immediate in terms of its negativity for growth. Well, my response is, how are central banks different? Why is it that governments can't allocate and politicians can't allocate resources? Why do we believe that central banks can? When central banks seek to influence credit markets and seek to direct credit to specific locales or countries, they instantaneously injure the economy because, once again, resources are being allocated in non-economic fashion. There's not even a near-term boom from central bank machinations. As a rule, when they act, there's less resources for the private sector to allocate. In terms of excess credit, there's quite simply no such thing. Once again, when you borrow money, you're borrowing resources, trucks, tractors, computers. The Fed cannot multiply them. It can't release them in excess. That's what we create in the real economy. But getting back to my examples from Hollywood, Silicon Valley, investment banking, Donald Trump, what we find, and this is a happy story, is that the Fed's just not that influential. Despite all of its efforts to make credit easy, in the real economy, the price of credit floats at rates that reflect reality. And again, that's a very positive statement. The Fed's just not that important. It staggers me that we give it so much attention. Its influence over the economy is just not that great. Now, the response I get to all this is something about quantitative easing. What I usually get from people is they'll say, okay, interesting theory you have here, but what about quantitative easing? From 2008 until 2014, the Fed oversaw a major program that not only stimulated the U.S. economy, but also stimulated a major stock market boom. They say, what's your answer to that? And I say, my answer is you need to check your assumptions, because what you believe is belied by basic common sense. Now, about quantitative easing, let's talk about what that is economically first. That was the Fed borrowing $4 trillion from banks and proceeding to buy up U.S. treasuries with an eye on influencing long rates of interest downward, and also buying up mortgages to stimulate the housing market. So let's get one thing out of the way right here. Quantitative easing had nothing to do with economic growth. As a rule, it weakened the economy. And that's the case because governments, once again, can't spend us to prosperity. They can only misallocate the wealth we've already created. As for housing, it is not a driver of economic activity. When you buy a house, your purchase of a house doesn't make you more productive. It doesn't open up foreign markets for you. It doesn't lead to cancer cures that elongate life. It doesn't lead to software innovations that make us more productive. It doesn't expand time. Housing is consumption that reduces the amount of capital available for entrepreneurs and businesses to expand. And so QE on its face was an economic depressant, not a driver of growth, at which point, to believe that it stimulated a stock market boom, you have to believe that the deepest markets in the world, that is the U.S. markets, populated by the most sophisticated investors in the world, were tricked by something so plainly inimical to economic growth. I think the very idea offends what we're all about. The idea that these guys could trick the smartest markets in the world, let's be serious. But I get all the responses. And one of my favorite ones came from an economist in Austin, Texas. He said, "Oh, no, John, you're not an economist. See, you don't understand. The Fed, in conducting quantitative easing, signaled to investors that we've got your back, that if you buy equities, we'll protect you. We'll keep those markets propped up." And that's what caused the stock market rally. And he added, "I learned this from a Nobel laureate economist." And I said, "Okay, Lacey, great point, but if what you say is true, can you explain to me Japan? Because, see, Japan's central bank has foisted no less than 11 QEs on its economy since the early 1990s with no corresponding stock market rally. Are Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke utterly competent in ways that, Japan's central bankers don't have a clue?" And the response you get from that is, "Well, but John, see, you don't understand. What the Fed did was push down interest. The QE pushed down interest rates across in the U.S. such that people had to get into equities because that was the only place where they could get any kind of reasonable yield." And I say, okay, that's, again, a really interesting theory, except I hope you'll explain to me Japan once again, because it's had lower interest rates across the yield curve for decades, but its stock market is still half of what it was in 1989. And I say, also, why didn't the stocks rally in 2000, 2001 when the Fed was aggressively pushing down rates, yet stocks went into free fall? Did it not work there? Was Alan Greenspan maybe not as skillful as Ben Bernanke? And they kind of dissemble and they say, well, yeah, but see, John, you don't understand. See, what actually happened is that the Fed, in conducting quantitative easing, drove down yields on bonds so much that equities became the only game in town. People had rotated out of these low-yielding bonds into equities. And I say, okay, again, a very interesting theory, but if what you say is true, there would have been a massive correction in bonds from 2008 to 2014 that would have reflected this rotation out of low-yielding bonds into equities, but that never occurred. The only major correction in bonds occurred after Donald Trump was elected. I don't see your argument. Please explain. They say, well, yeah, but see, you're not getting it. The Fed created $4 trillion that had to find its way into the stock market. And it had nowhere to go but the stock market. And I say, well, it didn't really create $4 trillion, but if you want to believe that, that's fine. But for $4 trillion to enter the stock market, by definition, $4 trillion must exit. In this netherworld inhabited by economists and academics, there are only buyers. But in the real world, for a buyer to express optimism, a seller must be able to express an equal amount of pessimism. For a QE-excited optimist to express that view in the stock market, as a rule, a QE skeptic must get to express an equal amount of pessimism. In markets, they are always and everywhere populated by buyers and sellers. For a bull to be optimistic in the market, a bear must express an equal amount of pessimism. These things equal each other out. At which point, we get to the basic truth about markets themselves. They quite simply do not price in the present. They always price in the future. Well, the Fed's official program of quantitative easing ended in 2014, but it telegraphed its end as early as 2011. So if, in fact, QE had been the driver of this stock market rally, logic dictates that stocks would have corrected and corrected for good long before 2014 to reflect the Fed's eventual end of the program. But, in fact, stocks have continued to reach new highs. There's quite simply no evidence, despite what we're told, that the Fed created a stock market rally. But there are lots of people who believe that. Most economists will tell you that. Most economists will say he doesn't know what he's talking about. You can read Morgan Stanley's Ruchir Sharma. He regularly puts op-eds into the Wall Street Journal saying, oh no, we on Wall Street realized that this stock market boom was just a creation of the Fed. And so you're welcome to that point of view. I fully agree that I am on the outside on this, making a different argument. But if you believe that, if you believe the Fed, despite all evidence and logic, was the source of a major stock market rally over these last several years, what you must then acknowledge is that in creating a stock market rally, the Fed robbed us of one that would have been quite a bit greater. And the reason for that is fairly basic. Recessions are once again healthy. They signal an economy cleansing itself of what doesn't work. Economies gain strength from their weakness. In much the same way, stock markets gain strength from their weakness. It's when a market's correct that precious resources are redirected away from poorly run businesses to better run ones. So if in fact the Fed was the source of the rally, it kept precious resources in lousy marginal companies at the expense of much better ones, thus robbing us of a much healthier and higher stock market. And so again, that's the purpose of my book. My book is to unmask the Fed as not that important, as not that consequential. I say end what is an offense to common sense just because we don't need the Fed, but I have no illusions. The Fed will never be ended. No politician, no president, no Congress will ever end the Fed, rest assured. That's the bad news for those who want it over with. Here's the good news. Market forces are ending the Fed for us. The channel through which the Fed presumes to influence the economy is the banking system. The U.S. banking system presently represents 15% of total credit in the economy. That number is in free fall, and it is because banks are being suffocated before our eyes by the same federal government that saved them. And that number is going to drop. With the decline of banks, so declines the Fed's power. Market forces are ending the Fed for us. We don't need Congress to do it. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Let me do this.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of time for questions, and for that, I apologize. I got wrapped up in what he was saying. Please join me again in thanking John. Upon exiting this venue, our wonderful volunteers will enthusiastically accept your donation to the Savannah Book Festival. It is because of your generosity that we're able to keep it free. So thank you so much for coming, and forgive me for no questions.
You're all convinced. Yes.
No, he's already signed. She took your questions away. That's what happened. That's what. But my question